The Secret of the Indian by Lynne Reid Banks. Chapter 7. Patrick in Boone-Land. Patrick's journey through time and space was swift and painless. There was a strange sort of whoosh, during which he seemed to feel, for a split second, buffeted, as when two heavy trucks pass close by each other traveling at high speed in opposite directions. Then there was heat, silence, and stillness. He opened his eyes to the glare of a harsh sun and screwed them shut. He felt around with his hands. There seemed to be nothing directly in front of him, but he felt he was upright and leaning against something blanket-like, but stiffer, rather like a wall covered with flannel. Then he found there was something like a wide, thick cord across his middle, holding him against the soft wall. He opened his eyes cautiously. At first he couldn't see anything but glaring sunlight, but in a few moments he got accustomed to that and found himself staring out at an endless expanse of sand. "Well," he said aloud, "it's Texas, I suppose. So this must be a bit of desert or prairie or something." But where was he? Where in all this sand was he? He looked downward. His hands were resting on a thick rope-like thing, on a thick rope-like thing, as thick as his own leg, stretched quite tightly across his waist. Under his feet was something that curved away on either side of him and curled up several yards ahead of him. It was like standing on the brink of a huge, smooth, pale brown and empty riverbed. Behind him it rose up like the bank of the river. But the bank felt soft to his hand, and suddenly he realized what it was. It's a gigantic hat," he said aloud. "I'm tied to the crown of it, and this thing must be the hat band, only it's a huge leather cord." He wiggled down until he was free of the cord, into which he seemed to have been stuck quite casually, like a feather, or like the flies that fishermen sometimes stick in their hat bands. Suddenly Patrick remembered that Boone had had some kind of tiny favor, so small one could hardly see it, except that it was blue, like his own jeans and sweatshirt, and the cord around his much-loved cowboy hat. Patrick crawled rapidly across the width of the brim toward its curled-up edge. As he did so, he noticed for the first time the utter silence around him, and the fact that the hat was perfectly still. "I must be on Boone's head," he thought. "Why isn't the hat jiggling about as he rides?" He reached the edge of the brim, pulled himself up to it, and peered over, preparing himself to see an immense drop below. The sand lay no more than 4 or 5 times Patrick's own height beneath him. He could easily make out the individual grains, which looked to him like the shingle on an English beach, except that some of them were like lumps of yellow glass. Suddenly he stiffened and gasped. A huge creature about the size of a Galapagos tortoise moseyed by on 6 angled legs. Patrick shrank back behind the rim of the hat, then realizing it was merely some kind of beetle and that it couldn't reach him, he raised himself cautiously and followed its progress off across the endless expanse of sand. He looked around as far as he could for the enormous bulk of the hat, which loomed against the sky like a soft-cornered building. There was no sign of anything else alive. "The first thing is to get down from here," he thought. "Even if it's dangerous, there's no point in staying here." He considered the problem of getting down to the ground. If the sand below had been his size of sand, he might have risked jumping onto it. Or then again, he thought, peering down, he might not. But it would be suicide to jump down onto those big hard stones. He'd have to lower himself somehow. Patrick, unlike Omri, wasn't athletic. Patrick, unlike Omri, was athletic. He really shone in PE and loved climbing and jumping and swinging. What he needed now was some kind of rope, and of course the first thing he thought of was the hat band. He followed it around the crown of the hat again until he found the knot. Luckily, it was old. The leather itself was soft, and the knot loosely tied. By forcing one of the ends back upon itself through the knot twice, he managed to untie it. Then, with great effort, he managed to drag one end around the crown until he had about half of it at his disposal, and he carefully lowered the free end down over the brim. The immediate danger was that his weight, though relatively slight, would pull the whole thong to the ground when he tried to slide down it. But he had to risk that. Taking a deep breath, he threw his right leg over the stiff brim, embraced the thong with arms and legs as if he were sliding down a tree trunk, and away he went. He was down almost before he had time to think. and as his feet touched the stones, he felt the rest of the thong fall away from the hat. He just managed to leap aside as it fell, like an immense heavy snake, onto the ground, missing him by a hair's breadth. He took another deep breath and looked around. The first thing he saw was a huge, impenetrable mass of what looked like fine copper fuse wires. He touched one. It was very flexible. It certainly wasn't a wire. It was more like... Patrick gasped. He suddenly knew what it was, and knowing that, he knew in a flash that something had gone very wrong. The mass of wires was Boone's ginger hair, sticking out from underneath his hat. Patrick started to run. It was not easy, running on the glassy shingle, but, trying not to stumble too often, he made his way as fast as he could around to the other side of the huge thing, like a promontory, which was actually Boone's head, jutting out of the desert landscape. When he got there, he stopped, stared, stepped back, stared again. At last, he realized that to get the face in perspective, he would have to move back still farther. He turned and ran away from it for about 100 paces, then turned again. Now he could see it was Boone. He was lying on his side, the bulk of him rising from the flat desert floor like a range of hills. Though his face was turned to the side, the hat was lying horizontally across one ear, as if someone had dropped it there, not as if Boone had been wearing it when he toppled to the ground. On his bristly face was an expression that made Patrick very uneasy. In the distance, behind Patrick, loomed a large desert cactus, the top of which, like Jack's beanstalk, was too high for Patrick to see. It looked as if it were growing out of Boone's shoulder. Patrick narrowed his eyes. He focused on one wicked-looking cactus needle that stuck out against the hard blue of the sky just above Boone's uppermost arm. If he was breathing, even shallowly, the shoulder level would rise and the spike would disappear. It didn't. Patrick caught his own breath and held it until he nearly burst. He had suddenly realized his fatal mistake. He had taken a plastic Boone back with him. The living Boone had gone back to England, to Omri and Patrick's present, in the same instant that Patrick had come here. They must have crossed. That was the meaning of the whooshing sensation, of something passing him as he traveled through time and space. Patrick sat down abruptly, and as abruptly jumped up again. The glassy stones were very hot. Everything was very hot. He felt dizzy. He tottered back a few yards until he was in Boone's shadow and sank down again to think. He must have done something to Boone, who'd been clutched tightly in his hand when he climbed into the chest. Maybe he'd killed him. No maybe about it. Boone, in the instant of transfer, had fallen down here in the desert, breathless, lifeless. A terrible guilt, backed up by an overwhelming sorrow, threatened Patrick. But, being a very practical boy, he shoved them both roughly to the back of his mind and considered instead his own situation. He was on his own, no Boone to take care of him. Minute, helpless, miles from anywhere, and at the misery of the sun in the empty desert. It seemed a fairly safe bet that soon enough he would follow Boone once again, this time into the oblivion of death. And that is the end of Chapter 7.